Hello and welcome to another one of the videos and in fact series on my channel that I'm going to be making for no other reason than I feel like it, and my justification is, shut up, I'm going to be a nerd. Much like my ongoing F1 history series, this too will be a retrospective series about a sport that I love. A sport that also involves machinery, funnily enough. That is the sport of robot combat, popularised primarily, at least outside of America, by the show Robot Wars. I adore this show, and I'm kind of sad it's still been cancelled twice over its life now. Now, it has occurred to me that it is a bit weird that I'm so nostalgic for a TV show whose original run actually ended before I was even born. But at least here in the UK, the old episode would still get rerun all of the time on certain channels, and that's what I grew up with. I distinctly remember watching it and being immediately hooked on it, and I also distinctly remember watching the Series 6 Grand Final and being extremely depressed that Razor lost to Tornado, because I was a diehard Razor fanboy as a kid. But I've grown up now, and so therefore I want to take a look back at the glorious gift to humanity that was Robot Wars. So I present to you every UK Robot Wars robot, ever. For this list, I will only be including robots that appeared in a televised episode of the UK show, so no robots that exclusively fought in international versions of the show, like German Robot Wars or Robot Wars Extreme Warriors in the US. No robots that saw combat but didn't qualify for the main series. Those are the two ground rules, and even with them, the list is still going to be enormous. I'm going by the Robot Wars wiki page for this list, which is a fantastic website for anything that you're interested in robot combat. If it's on this list, it will be in these videos. We have nearly 650 robots to get through, so I'll be splitting the series up into alphabetical order. So all of the A's, then all of the B's, and so on. And if there aren't very many of a particular letter, maybe I'll do two in one go. But first, as an added piece of content that I want to make prior to the first video, I want to educate some of you who may be uninitiated and baptise you into the world of Robot Wars. You can call it Robot Wars 101. So firstly, what is robot combat? Well, it's about robots fighting. Throughout the show's lifespan, the fighting was always centre stage. While finer details have changed, the general structure has stayed the same and goes about as follows. The robots start an equal distance away from each other in the centre of the arena and they start facing each other. Activate is called, allowing robots to freely roam the arena, and no powering up of weapons is allowed to commence before Activate is called. The robots then have 3 minutes to kick each other's teeth in. In the event that a robot ends up out of the arena by any means, that robot is defeated by KO and Cease is called, instructing all competitors to cease movement and power down their robot systems and weaponry. If a robot appears to be immobile, defined as being able to freely move outside of its own circumference for more than 30 seconds, and the panel of judges agree that this is the case, a 10-second countdown is started, like in boxing. If the immobile robot fails to prove its mobility within those 10 seconds, it is out and Cease is called. If, after 3 minutes, no teeth have been sufficiently kicked in, Cease is called, and the judges then decide a winner based on given criteria such as damage caused, damage sustained, control shown, good or bad, and aggression shown. So what about the show itself? In the first series, the first Wars as it was known, consisted of 6 heats with 6 robots in each heat. The first round was known as the Gauntlet, a sort of robot obstacle course designed to test a driver's skill and a robot's agility, with the robot who covered the shortest distance being eliminated. The remaining 5 robots proceeded to the second round, the Trials. This round consisted of some kind of game that the robots had to play. Each heat had a different trial, such as a labyrinth or a sumo round. As with the Gauntlet, the worst performing robot would be booted out of the competition. Now, the remaining 4 got to do some fighting in the arena, equipped with hazards such as the Pit of Oblivion, as well as floor flippers, angle grinders, and spikes. It was also patrolled by the House Robots, giant, overpowered behemoths who were there to exact punishment on any robot that made the mistake of driving into their corner patrol zone, or CPZ. They would be drawn against each other in one-on-one fights before the winners met in the heat final, and the winner of that bout proceeding to the grand final. At the end of the series, the 6 heat winners participated in one big free-for-all battle. Last one standing was the champion. For Series 2, the format remained the same, however the increased number of competitors and heats meant there were now 2 semi-finals before the arena grand final. For Series 3 onwards, the Gauntlet and Trials were ditched, so the series was now all about fighting. Series 4 saw no meaningful changes, however between Series 4 and 5, a side series called Robot Wars Extreme aired. And yes, that does count for this list. For this series, the weight limit for heavyweight robots was upped from 80 kilograms to 100 kilograms. This was carried over for the rest of the show's original run. There were no massive changes for Series 5 to 7, a button for making the pit descend was added, a couple of hazards were added, a couple of house robots were added, but the general formula stayed the same. However, after Series 7, due to bad ratings because of a switch to an unsupportive Channel 5, Robot Wars was cancelled. When the reboot came 12 years later in 2016, much was changed as Robot Wars was modernised. The weight limit was increased once again from 100 kilograms to 110 kilograms. The arena built was brand new and had some new hazards, and the house robots were completely redesigned and beefed up to boot. The show also experimented with new competition styles such as a round-robin heat and point systems and so on. But I think I've talked too long about the show, let's talk about robots themselves. Here's the wonderful thing about Robot Wars and robot combat in general. There isn't a nailed-on formula for success. Any type of robot can be viable so long as it is A, driven well, and B, built well. As such, the diversity that you will see in this series will be incredible. Now, the Robot Wars regulations are extensive and they have changed a lot over time, but there are some general rules. Rule 1, don't try this at home. Robot combat is very dangerous. These things are not just expensive toys, they are 100 kilogram hunks of metal with active weaponry built out of industrial grade materials. These things could very easily grotesquely maim or even kill you. As such, safety is taken very seriously now, even if it wasn't so much in the early days of the show, but we'll get to that. There are official procedures that must be followed. For example, all robots must have what's called a removable link. Think of it like a key that provides power to all of the robot. When the key is in, it's armed and dangerous. When the key is removed, it's an inert lump of metal. This key must only be inserted in the arena or in designated test areas, never in the pits. On top of this, in the pits, all sharp edges must be covered, such as axe blades or spikes on the bodywork, as well as all flippers or spinners locked in place. Failure to comply with these rules can result in disqualification from the competition and expulsion from an event. These same penalties could also be dished out if your robot fails the numerous safety inspections it must go through both before and after fights. I really wish I could say that at least one thing all robots have in common is being a metal shell, but I can't even say that because some people have made robots out of wood. But generally, most are made of metal. Although some do opt to use the same kind of plastic that's used to make riot shields and bulletproof glass for some of their robots. All heavyweight robots must conform to a weight limit of 110 kilograms, as well as constraints on their dimensions. For locomotion, most use wheels or sometimes tracks. However, robots with legs that employ a shuffling and walking type movement are seen, although they are rare. Despite being permitted an extra 35 kilograms to their weight limit to account for their complexity, most don't bother with walkers because unless done very efficiently, they are about as slow as molasses. Like, the most successful walker that Robot Wars ever saw was Anarchy, and that didn't even reach a semi-final. Other methods for propulsion are permitted, such as ground effect air cushions like a hovercraft, although no one has been quite mad enough to try that yet, as far as I know. Interestingly, there are no rules that state that your robot must be driven by a human. A completely autonomous robot is completely legal. However, in the original show from the late 90s and the early 2000s, AI was nowhere near sophisticated enough to accomplish this, and by the time of the reboot from 2016 to 2018, some teams experimented with semi-autonomous elements, perhaps most famously Nuts 2 with their multi-brain technology. Still, a fully autonomous machine has yet to be seen. Maybe soon though. In terms of propulsion, the most common is to use electric motors drawing their power from a set of batteries, typically lithium polymer batteries in modern times. As such, these robots have components known as speed controllers, much like sophisticated RC cars. This is because, as they are, batteries and motors really don't like responding to the binary on-off inputs of a radio control device, and it would make the robot almost impossible to control with any degree of nuance. Speed controllers allow for the power to be fed variably to the wheels, allowing for much greater control. If you use motors, there are no limits imposed on how many you can have. Your only constraint, of course, is how heavy they are. So some robots are two-wheel drive, some opt for four-wheel drive, and even beyond that in order to achieve better pushing power. A petrol engine, paired in tandem with a gearbox, is also legal for means of propulsion. These were more common in the early days as it was easier just to shove an engine from your lawnmower into a metal shell than it was to learn complicated electrics, but in recent times petrol power is seldom used due to the added risks of flammability that it poses. When it comes to powering your weaponry, it really depends on what type of weapon you have. All robots must have some form of active weaponry. This is because people realised kind of quickly that watching two metal boxes drive into each other for 3 minutes was kind of boring. Some weapons could just be powered electrically off of a motor or by using petrol. However, robots that incorporate an axe or a flipping mechanism will often be fitted with a pneumatic system, using compressed gas to fire weaponry. For example, CO2 fire extinguishers can be used in such systems. Other than CO2 or compressed air, no other gases are permitted, and all pneumatic systems cannot exceed more than 1000 psi of operating pressure, which is about 68 bar. Robots that employ a crushing type of weaponry will pretty much exclusively opt for hydraulics. Hydraulics are a perfect fit for a crushing type of weapon, as despite greater complexity, you can get much more force out of them, with the maximum operating limit of 10,000 psi compared to 1,000, 10 times greater than pneumatics. However, hydraulics are slow-moving, meaning axes and flippers that require quick strikes will still opt for pneumatics, which still provide plenty of punch in their own right. Extra rules are placed on spinners and flywheels. This is due to how dangerous they can be, as they may send bits of robots hurtling across the arena at a moment's notice. If you build a spinner, you might not even be able to compete at some events due to their arena not being able to withstand the forces they create. And even if you can compete, often you will be required to send the organisers a separate set of dimensions and schematics just for the spinner. Some types of weaponry are banned, such as electricity, radio jamming, for obvious reasons, EMPs, obviously. If your robot uses a spinning blade, it must not be a hardened blade, as these are very easy to shatter and can send shrapnel flying across the arena. Also banned are untethered projectiles, fire, so no flamethrowers, except for those robots apparently, or liquid weaponry, such as glue. When building a robot, it's important to ensure that your robot cannot end up beached on its back like a turtle, as this counts as being immobile. This can be achieved by making your robot low enough so that it can run both ways up, or to incorporate what will now become your first piece of Robot Wars terminology, a SRIMECH. This is an acronym which stands for Self-Righting Mechanism. These can be passive, such as just having the robot shaped in a way that if it's on its back it will just roll back over, or active, such as a special arm, or using weapons themselves like axes or flippers to self-right. This was first pioneered by the robot Cassius and was then swiftly copied by everybody else, and now every serious robot you see will have one. When it comes to arming your robot, you do have many options, such as flippers, usually powered by pneumatics. These are especially common in the UK scene, as many competitions, for safety reasons, restrict heavyweight spinners to a total RPM of only 500, making them basically useless. A flipper design does not create much damage in and of itself. The most damage a flipper will cause is the internal shock to components that opponents will suffer when they hit the floor. Instead of the main aim of a flipper is to send the opponent over the arena wall to secure a KO. This will henceforth be referred to as your second piece of Robot Wars terminology, an OOTER, meaning out of the arena. Despite not being highly damaging, flippers are still powerful and if driven well are scary foes, as any driving mistakes on your part can be swiftly punished. Another advantage of flippers is that they can use their flipper as an integrated SRIMECH rather than having to fashion a separate one, decreasing complexity and saving weight. However, a downside of flippers, and all pneumatic-powered weapons, is that they have a limited capacity and also won't function at peak power for the whole fight. You only have a limited number of flips that will gradually get weaker and weaker and weaker until the robot won't be able to self-right anymore. CO2 systems are also known for being quite finicky in the cold, meaning your weapon might cease working entirely despite nothing being broken, leaving your robot an easy target. There are two types of flipper mechanism, rear-hinged and front-hinged. Rear-hinged flippers are the more common and allow for more powerful flips and more consistent OOTERs, whereas front-hinged design is rarer but offers more control and makes for more efficient self-righting, at the cost of it being more difficult to achieve an OOTER. Famous flipper designs include Apollo, Chaos 2, and Eruption. A related offshoot to flipping weapons is lifting weapons. These are more prevalent in the early days of Robot Wars before robots like Chaos 2 really showed the superiority of a flipper. But they still have their own advantages. Typically powered electrically, their goal was not to OOTER the opponent or really to cause damage, but to control a fight. These robots were often seen engaging in what is known as pit tactics, which is exactly what you think. Pick the opponent up and dump them in the pit. Famous examples of this design include Panic Attack and Behemoth. There are also spinners. These come in many forms such as bars, discs, both horizontal and vertical, drums, and even full body spinners. Such designs take advantage of the laws of physics to exact devastating damage. That being, if you spin something really heavy, really fast, it stores an enormous amount of kinetic energy that can be dished out on contact with another robot. Such spinners weigh a good chunk of the robot's allowed weight and are usually powered electrically. For example, Carbide's bar weighed 25 kilos and span up to 2300 RPM, resulting in a tip speed well in excess of 200 miles an hour, and, according to the team, this meant it had imparted as much energy on contact as a sniper's bullet. Times 60. Yeah, you start to see why submariners ban these things. However, a weakness of a spinner design is that they do almost as much damage to themselves as they do to other opponents. The impacts are so violent that you must take extra precaution in protecting the internals from shock upon impact, and even then it might not do the trick. Very often a spinner's downfall is that it knocks out its own vital components during a match. Spinners are also quite difficult to put a SRIMECH on. They can use the weapon itself to self-right, but such a method is unreliable. So many either opt for having an invertible design or using a designated arm, many of which fail to work as intended. Another characteristic of spinners that add to their intimidation factor is the drone, whir or hum, or in some cases the roar of their weapon when it's at full speed. This is sometimes referred to as a death hum or a death rattle. Notable spinners include Carbide, Hypnodisc, Aftershock, Magnetar, and Typhoon 2. The last truly common design is that of the axe bot, utilising an overhead axe design that swings down in order to punch or bludgeon an opponent. These are normally powered by CO2 and therefore possess the same weaknesses and strengths really as flippers, that being limited capacity but ability to use the weapon as a SRIMECH. Axe designs typically take on two forms, either a spiked axe or a bladed axe. A spiked axe is better suited to puncturing opponent's armour in an attempt to damage internals directly. Such a design is suited to more precision, however it can come with the risk of your axe getting stuck in an opponent, meaning you can't do any more damage. A bladed design is less about piercing and more about bludgeoning your opponent into submission, and generally favour a less precise, more chaotic flurry of attacks. Axe bots, especially the spiked kinds, have decreased drastically in popularity, mostly due to the fact that armour on robots has advanced considerably to the point of making such a weapon relatively ineffective. Notable axe bots include Dominator 2, Terahertz, and Thor. A rarer type of weapon system, both due to complexity and more advanced modern armour, is that of the hydraulic crusher. Crushers can be extremely powerful weapons. The theory is very simple.
The best way to destroy steel is actually to stick it in a press. Now me and Simon, we thought long and hard about this. We were looking at kind of rotary disc ideas, axes and things like that. We're only going to get like a small hole, so to stick it in a fly press and actually crush it down would be much better. So the big plier idea came through.
As I mentioned earlier, hydraulics have a much higher ceiling for pressure in the regulations. They also do have the problem of limited capacity like pneumatics do, as all of the liquid is recycled over and over again through the system. However, hydraulics are slow acting, so such builds do require an extra degree of driving skill in order to utilise their hydraulics effectively. Crushers do come in both horizontal and vertical forms, with vertical being the more common, typically using a hydraulic pump on a hinge mechanism to push down with its force. Some horizontal crushers are actually designed to function more like pincers. Like lifters, these play very well into pit tactics. A good example of all three types would be Razor, Can Opener, and Tough as Nails. There are other less common designs, such as thwack bots, such as Stinger or Gabriel 2. These are robots that either employ a sit-and-spin tactic or utilise torque reaction, meaning that as the robot decelerates, a weapon comes swinging forward as the robot's mass pivots around an axis. Some robots also take advantage of their powerful drive instead of weapons. Typically 4-wheel drive and using at least 4 motors, such robots have an excellent pushing power and top speed and use the robot itself as a weapon, ramming into their opponents over and over again in the hopes of breaking something. As such, these are called rambots. Notable rambots include Storm 2 and Tornado. The last kind of bot that is prevalent enough to be worthy of a mention in this prelude is the cluster bot. See, with the weight limit of 110 kilograms. But nowhere in the rules does it say this only needs to be made up of one robot. So long as the total weight of the robot doesn't exceed 110 kilograms, you're good. And so clusterbots were born. Such a robot can harry an opponent very effectively by dividing their attention. However, splitting your robot into fractions means that you also have to split your armour and your weapon potency into fractions. As such, the individual members of a clusterbot tend to crumble if challenged one-on-one. There aren't many clusterbots in Robot Wars history. Gemini was the most well-known, and in general clusterbots are more famous for their novelty rather than their success. And now, finally, I believe you will know enough to follow along on this torturous journey that I have decided to put myself through. I'll see you at the start of the list.